Chapter 1: Molecules of Mind. There is a moment in evolution. We cannot date it precisely, but let us say somewhere deep in the unfolding history of life, when qualia stopped merely passing through living creatures and began seeking space within the mind itself. Before that, life was almost entirely reactive. Light struck a primitive eye, and the creature turned. A shadow crossed the grasslands, and the herd fled. A chemical gradient shifted in the water, and the bacterium swam toward nourishment or away from danger. Consciousness existed, but it was local, immediate, tied directly to ecosystems and the survival needs unfolding within them. The deer knew the forest path. The salmon knew the river. The wolf knew the scent of blood. Qualia guided them all. The sweetness of ripe fruit, the ache of hunger, the smell of rain before a storm, the warmth of the herd at night. These were not abstractions, but direct experiences arising from ecosystems themselves. Consciousness mirrored the outer landscape, but eventually something changed. Human nervous systems entered increasingly complex environments, shaped by tools, fire, language, memory, social hierarchies, agriculture, trade, and cities. Qualiadelic signals flooded the brain faster than instinct alone could process them. Immediate reaction became dangerous in crowded social landscapes, where survival depended not merely upon reflex, but upon hesitation, comparison, memory, and symbolic thinking. The nervous system had to slow down, and in that hesitation, qualia thickened. Mind, a sixth sense, was born when qualia learned to endure. A neuron responds to the qualities of neurochemicals, their timing, polarity, charge, shape, and rhythm. One chemical excites it, while another quiets it. One strengthens pathways, while another inhibits them. At the most primitive level, the neuron discriminates qualities. It responds to qualia. We should not imagine that neurons think in the human sense, but neither should we imagine them as utterly inert. Like roots sensing moisture beneath the soil or bacteria following chemical gradients through water, neurons possess local consciousness. A frog likely knows its pond intimately while understanding nothing of the wider world beyond it. The roots of a tree may know little of leaves and sunlight except through the sugars flowing downward from above. So it is with neurons, sensing only the neurochemical landscape surrounding them. But as brains became more complex, these local consciousnesses began colliding with one another. Signals overlapped. Delay entered the system. The brake had to modulate the gas pedal. Instead of reacting instantly to every stimulus, the nervous system had to pause long enough to compare possibilities, simulate outcomes, remember patterns, and reflect. And in that delay, experience pooled. John Locke once proposed that simple ideas combine into complex ideas, much like atoms combine into molecules. Most philosophers treat this as mere metaphor, but perhaps Locke stumbled upon something far deeper than he realized. Qualia clusters. It resonates. It stabilizes. One memory binds itself to a smell. A fear attaches itself to a face. A hope joins itself to a vision of the future. Constellating ideas are the molecules of the mind. Chapter 2: Archetypes of the Addictive Landscape. During my walks, my favorite conscious ritual, I often hold two seemingly unrelated ideas in awareness and let them drift together without forcing them. At first, there is only noise, chatter left over from the big dopamine human landscape. But eventually, a third idea suddenly crystallizes between them. The ideas resonate. A new pattern stabilizes. It feels less invented than received, as though ecosystems themselves are offering gifts through the spaces between thoughts. Ideas attract one another by sharing qualia. This is how mind evolves, not merely through logic, but through constellations of memory, sensation, archetype, symbol, and feeling. Carl Jung understood something essential here. Archetypes are not simply mythological images floating in some supernatural realm. They are enduring symbolic patterns emerging from the long interaction between consciousness and landscape. The mother, the hero, the trickster, the wise elder, the shadow. These figures stabilize because they reflect recurring conditions of survival, danger, transformation, and belonging. Archetypes are ecosystems translated into mind. Healthy ecosystems produce healthy archetypes. The respectful hunter, the healer, the wise elder who guides without domination, the wanderer who returns bearing wisdom for the community. But distorted human landscapes generate distorted archetypes as well. The modern Messiah is one such archetype. In ecosystems, no creature dominates forever. Rivers shift course, forests burn and regrow, predators weaken, seasons turn. Balance emerges through participation rather than conquest. But in the addictive human landscape, salvation increasingly becomes externalized. We long for the heroic leader who will redeem the nation, restore meaning, punish enemies, and save us from uncertainty. Hegel believed that great leaders embodied the spirit of the state itself. Napoleon fascinated him because he appeared to incarnate history moving through a single individual. The leader became more than a person. He became the symbolic vessel through which collective destiny unfolded. There is something deeply seductive about this idea because traumatized societies crave coherence. When the inner landscape fractures, people begin searching for an external center powerful enough to hold everything together. The political messiah emerges whenever communities lose faith in their own participatory intelligence. But this archetype mirrors the addictive structure of the big dopamine economy itself. Big dopamine thrives upon spectacle, spikes, urgency, intensity, and dependency. It rewards emotional amplification over grounded continuity. Advertising tells us we are incomplete without the next purchase. Media tells us catastrophe is always moments away. Politics tells us only total victory can save us. And craving eventually seeks a savior. The leader becomes less a human being than a symbolic carrier of unresolved collective need. The leader embodies the state because the population no longer feels capable of embodying shared meaning themselves. Ecosystems, on the other hand, do not function through rescue fantasies. No single tree saves the forest. No single wolf saves the pack. No single river commands the watershed. Chapter 3: Big Dopamine and Love. The same addictive structures shaping politics and economics now shape love itself. Big dopamine love disguises dependency as transcendence. When people first enter addictive tropes of love, the experience can feel spiritually enormous. The world sharpens, colors brighten, music becomes unbearably meaningful. Every glance, silence, delay, touch, or text message feels charged with cosmic significance. Consciousness narrows around a single emotional sun. This is why big dopamine love so often resembles religious experience. The beloved becomes an archetype before they remain a person. One person unconsciously seeks the nurturing mother, another seeks the absent father, another seeks redemption, another seeks escape from loneliness, another seeks intensity because stillness itself feels unsafe. People believe they are pursuing love when they are actually pursuing relief from fragmentation. Love can be a form of intermittent reinforcement that is almost perfectly tuned to the nervous system. Not satisfaction, but almost. Not union, but nearly. And nearly turns out to be one of the most addictive constellations of qualia available to us. This is where the big dopamine economy enters, like gasoline poured onto fire. The modern economy continuously generates dissatisfaction while promising relief just over the horizon. The next purchase, the next outrage, the next reinvention of the self, the next romantic high. Big dopamine love almost always depends upon instability. Stable love, on the other hand, little dopamine love, does not generate enough uncertainty to sustain addiction. A person who feels complete consumes less. A person grounded in belonging is harder to manipulate. A person connected deeply with ecosystems requires fewer artificial stimulants. Traumatized nervous systems often interpret peace not as safety, but as emptiness. Chaos feels more alive because chaos resembles the emotional environments in which attachment originally formed. Trauma reshapes the archetypal field itself. The wounded child becomes an adult who unconsciously confuses emotional volatility with depth. Intermittent affection feels more meaningful than steady affection because unpredictability intensifies attention. The nervous system adapts brilliantly to unstable landscapes. The tragedy is that these adaptations persist long after the original unstable family environment has disappeared. Romantic culture mirrors this structure perfectly. Dating applications turn human beings into intermittent rewards. Social media converts attraction into performance. Advertising sexualizes nearly everything because desire itself has become economically useful. All the while, people become increasingly unable to distinguish longing from love. Big dopamine love feeds upon absence. The beloved must remain partially unavailable because complete arrival would collapse the fantasy structure. This is why so many people unconsciously sabotage stable relationships once genuine intimacy begins emerging. Real intimacy dissolves projection. It forces us to encounter another person as they actually are, rather than as symbolic carriers of salvation. And that encounter can feel terrifying because once projection collapses, we must finally face ourselves. This is why the commandment to know thyself becomes central to love. Without self-knowledge, people enter relationships carrying invisible archetypal burdens they expect the other person to resolve. One partner unconsciously becomes healer, another becomes parent, another becomes rescuer, another becomes stabilizer, another becomes messiah. Love becomes political in the Hegelian sense. The beloved is expected to embody the wounded inner state and hold it together through sheer symbolic force. But no human being can sustain that role indefinitely. Sooner or later, the archetypal inflation breaks apart. The beloved fails to save us. The projections crack. Resentment enters. Dependency alternates with disappointment. Spike, loop, withdrawal, craving, repeat. The same structure appears in political movements. Citizens project impossible hopes onto leaders because collective trauma creates longing for coherence. The leader becomes romanticized as embodiment of the nation itself, just as the beloved becomes embodiment of emotional completion. Crowds seek in politics what wounded lovers seek in romance: rescue from fragmentation. This is not the way ecosystems work. Rescue is rarely needed because the qualia that leads us to what is needed for survival and contentment is always ready to reveal itself. Sometimes there may be lack, and sometimes there may be abundance. But the next season, the lack or the abundance is ended. In that, there is always faith, not addiction. Qualiadelic love feels so different from big dopamine love that at first it may even feel underwhelming to nervous systems conditioned by addiction. It lacks the constant spikes of uncertainty and obsession. It does not narrow consciousness into fixation. Instead, it widens our awareness. The other person ceases to be an object upon whom we project illusions and becomes part of an ecosystem of shared qualia, a qualiadelic relationship. Time slows, presence deepens, the body relaxes, conversation becomes exploratory rather than performative, sex becomes participatory rather than goal-driven, silence becomes tolerable, ordinary moments become luminous. Qualiadelic love, little dopamine love, is not weaker than big dopamine love. In many ways, it is more intense, but the intensity is distributed rather than spiked, a qualiadelic field. It resembles the steady vitality of ecosystems themselves rather than the violent surges of addiction. A forest is not constantly exploding into ecstasy, yet it is profoundly alive. Conscious ritualing matters in relationships. Ritual slows attention enough for the nervous system to rediscover subtler forms of pleasure. Walking together, breathing together, cooking, listening, touch without immediate goal, shared silence, shared creativity. These experiences strengthen little dopamine pathways rather than reinforcing compulsive spikes. Over time, the archetype of love itself changes. The lover ceases to be savior and becomes companion. The relationship ceases to be escape and becomes belonging. Sex ceases to be conquest and becomes communication. Participation ceases to depend upon intensity and begins resting in continuity. Love stops feeling like possession and begins feeling like ecology, not two isolated selves consuming one another emotionally, but two living systems participating in a larger field of meaning together. The relationship becomes less like addiction and more like a watershed, flowing, seasonal, nourishing, alive. Chapter 4: Trauma, Ecosystems, and Conscious Ritual. Trauma is not merely an individual wound. It is an ecological disturbance within consciousness itself. Healthy ecosystems provide relatively reliable feedback. Seasons change, storms arrive, winters become harsh, but the larger rhythms endure. Creatures develop trust in the continuity of life itself. The nervous system learns that even periods of scarcity belong to a larger cycle. But unstable human environments, especially traumatized families and addictive economies, teach the opposite lesson. Attention becomes conditional. Care becomes unpredictable. Safety disappears suddenly. The nervous system becomes vigilant, scanning constantly for signs of danger, rejection, or approval. Under these conditions, intensity begins to feel more real than stability. This is why big dopamine love becomes so compelling, and it is also why ecosystems matter so deeply. In natural ecosystems, creatures receive endless little dopamine gifts: water, shade, migration routes, the smell of fertile soil, the ripening of berries, the cooling evening air. These pleasures arrive rhythmically and naturally. They do not overwhelm the nervous system long enough to create addiction. The forest does not scream for attention, yet it is profoundly alive. The big dopamine economy, by contrast, amplifies stimulation beyond what nervous systems evolved to handle. The result is not fulfillment, but dysregulation. Addiction spreads everywhere: substances, media, politics, consumerism, sex, status, identity, even spirituality itself. And so the mind loses its ecosystemic grounding. Again, conscious ritualing becomes important. Ritual slows attention enough for the nervous system to rediscover subtler forms of belonging. Walking, breathing, listening, cooking, meditating, making music. Shared silence. Touch without immediate goal. These experiences strengthen little dopamine pathways rather than reinforcing compulsive spikes. At first, conscious ritualing may appear simple, even foolish. The Tao Te Ching says that one who has found the way appears to others to be a fool. But ecosystems have always operated through subtlety rather than spectacle. A river reshapes mountains patiently. Fungi connect entire forests invisibly beneath the soil. Seasons transform the world slowly. So it is with consciousness. When we consciously ritual, we begin to pay attention to new qualia. It reveals itself to us, a revelation, but a subtle revelation. We are stimulated by little dopamine, which changes our desire from craving to contentment. Then, behavior changes. Finally, the outer landscape begins changing as well. What exists in the mind manifests first in the brain, then in the body, and eventually in the world. Qualia reshapes neural pathways. Neural pathways reshape behavior. Behavior reshapes culture. Culture reshapes landscapes. Healing begins invisibly before it becomes visible, sensible. Life happens qualiadelically before it manifests materially. Chapter 5. Know Thyself. The Chinese philosopher Chuangzi harkens us back to that time, just after we slipped the bonds of the natural landscape, but before the human landscape enslaved us. After the Tao, the way, was lost, then arose the landmarks and pathways of humanity, justice, character, and manners. Jesus, too, expected us to free ourselves from social order and social control. This is what is meant by his surprising scold. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. It is not that we should not love our families, our communities, or our culture, but one can only find the truth within. A Christian does not follow Jesus, but opens the heart to him, and the power of God fills the soul and spreads out through the world. Just so, when we open our minds to the beneficence of ecosystems, qualia fills the inner consciousness. The Greek philosopher Socrates also warned his pupils not to put his trust in that which is external and depends on signs that belong to others. He wanted his students to remember from the inside, completely on their own. He commanded his students, and all of us, to know thyself. Only within oneself could the truth about right and wrong be found. Nobody can tell it to us. The flowering of inner consciousness has evolved with the human landscape, but as its shadow. The greatest minds have always attempted to show us the error of our material ways. If we pay attention and ritual consciously, ecosystems will pour qualia into our inner landscapes, our minds. The pure, clear-minded self is connected directly with the power of ecosystems. These traditions differ enormously, yet they converge upon one insight. Salvation does not come through conformity to external structures alone. To know oneself is not narcissistic self-analysis. It is discovering that consciousness itself is ecological. The mind is not an isolated machine trapped inside the skull. It is an ecosystem nested within larger ecosystems. Thoughts arise relationally. Archetypes arise relationally. Identity arises relationally. Even suffering reflects distortions in the landscapes through which consciousness moves. In the distant past, before cities, before ideology, before the addictive human landscape swallowed attention whole, the mind was mostly a reflection of the outer world. Consciousness mirrored forests, rivers, storms, seasons, migrations, and ecosystems directly. Qualia entered nervous systems through the senses and guided creatures toward what they needed to survive. But as symbolic consciousness expanded, the outward-facing senses became increasingly distorted by abstraction, spectacle, and endless stimulation. Instead of ecosystems shaping consciousness directly, artificial human landscapes hijacked attention. Billboards, screens, brands, ideologies, status systems, political fantasies, and addictive romances all competed to capture the nervous system. The mind became less a reflection of ecosystems and more a reflection of distorted symbolic environments, and yet ecosystems never stopped speaking. The gifts never stopped flowing. They only became harder to hear beneath the noise. Now something new is becoming possible, or perhaps something very old is returning. The mind is no longer merely a reflection of the outward landscape. Increasingly, it can become a reflection of ecosystems themselves. The qualia which once flowed into the mind through distorted outward-facing senses can now flow into consciousness directly from ecosystems, pure and refreshing like water rising from an artesian well. The moment we recognize ecosystems as the true source of Earth's bounty, we reconnect ourselves to that wellspring. The healing begins invisibly before it appears materially. First, the nervous system slows, then attention changes, then desire changes, then participation changes, and eventually the world changes. Big dopamine gives way to little dopamine, quieter satisfactions, participation, creativity, contribution, presence, and belonging. Contentment replaces desire. Joy replaces ecstasy. The political messiah fades because we no longer require external salvation. Big dopamine love softens because belonging is no longer scarce. Competition relaxes because meaning is no longer tied entirely to ownership and domination. The old archetypes do not disappear entirely, but they transform. The hero ceases to be conqueror and becomes steward. The wise figure ceases to dominate and begins guiding. The lover ceases to possess and begins participating. The self ceases to isolate and begins belonging. Perhaps this is the deeper evolutionary movement hidden beneath history itself. Qualia learned to endure. Then Qualia learned to reflect. Now Qualia may be learning how to heal. Not through domination, not through ideology, not through another messiah, but through ecosystems becoming conscious of themselves within us. Conclusion: the return to ecosystems. What we call the modern crisis appears to us in fragments. We speak of political collapse, addiction, loneliness, ecological devastation, anxiety, polarization, failed relationships, consumerism, and the loss of meaning as though they were separate disorders erupting independently across society. But perhaps they are all symptoms of a single underlying disturbance. Consciousness has lost its relationship with ecosystems. For most of human history, the mind reflected the landscapes around it. Forests, rivers, migrations, seasons, storms, predators, prey, sunlight, darkness. These shaped perception directly. Qualia flowed inward through the senses and organized nervous systems around participation in the living world. Creatures did not merely inhabit ecosystems, ecosystems inhabited the creatures. But symbolic consciousness expanded. Human beings developed language, cities, ideology, trade, technology, and increasingly artificial landscapes. The outward-facing senses became overwhelmed by stimulation. The old rhythms of ecosystems were drowned beneath a flood of competing signals demanding attention. The human landscape ceased reflecting ecosystems and began reflecting addiction itself. This is the big dopamine economy, an economy organized around spikes of stimulation, emotional amplification, dependency, and longing. It trains us to seek fulfillment externally, in possessions, identities, lovers, leaders, ideologies, status, spectacle. Even our archetypes become distorted under its influence. The hero becomes conqueror, the lover becomes savior, the leader becomes messiah, the self becomes isolated and performative. And because traumatized people crave coherence, we increasingly seek salvation through external figures and external systems. We search for political redeemers. We search for perfect romance. We search for ideologies that promise certainty, but none of these can stabilize consciousness permanently, because the instability originates deeper than politics, deeper than economics, deeper even than culture itself. The disturbance is ecological. We have forgotten that the mind is an ecosystem nested within larger ecosystems, yet ecosystems never stopped speaking. Even now, beneath the noise of the human landscape, they continue pouring qualia into consciousness. The gifts never ceased flowing. We simply became too distracted to notice them. This is why the ancient command to know thyself remains revolutionary. To know oneself is not merely to analyze one's history, personality, or private desires. It is to recognize that consciousness itself is relational. The metaphor of the molecules of mind points toward something essential here. As the neuro landscape became increasingly crowded and complex, nervous systems could no longer react instantly to every signal flowing through them. The brain had to pause. Reflection entered the system. And in that hesitation, qualia began clustering together into stable patterns, the way atoms form molecules. Ideas became living structures. A memory attached itself to a feeling. A symbol connected itself to an archetype. A fear stabilized into identity. A hope crystallized into belief. Qualia learned to endure by binding itself together into increasingly complex constellations of meaning. This is why the mind is not separate from nature, but one of nature's ecosystems. Forests arise through networks of roots, fungi, rainfall, sunlight, decay, and cooperation. Rivers arise through watersheds. Coral reefs arise through countless organisms participating together in living balance. In exactly the same way, thoughts, emotions, archetypes, memories, and desires arise relationally within the ecosystem of consciousness itself. The mind is not an escape from nature, it is nature becoming reflective. In the past, our minds were mostly reflections of the landscapes outside of us. But now something new is becoming possible, or perhaps something very old is returning. The mind can become a reflection of ecosystems themselves. The qualia, which once flowed into consciousness only through distorted outward-facing senses, can now flow directly into the mind from ecosystems, pure and refreshing, like water rising from an artesian well. The moment we recognize ecosystems as the true source of Earth's bounty, we reconnect ourselves to that hidden spring, and because what exists in the mind manifests first in the brain, then in the body, and finally in the world, this realization changes everything. The old archetypes begin transforming. The hero ceases to conquer and begins to steward. The wise figure ceases to dominate and begins to guide. The lover ceases to possess and begins to participate. The self ceases to isolate and begins to belong. Perhaps this is the deeper evolutionary movement hidden beneath history itself. In the brain, qualia learned to endure, and now qualia may be learning how to heal, not through domination, not through ideology, not through another messiah, but through ecosystems becoming conscious of themselves within us.